Good morning, Ida here. Today I thought I'd talk a little bit about ancestors and ancestral trauma in particular from a European perspective, because what I've noticed is that a lot of the resources, a lot of people that talk about ancestral trauma tend to be Americans, and they put a lot of emphasis on the colonization of the Americas, on the genocide of Native Americans, and on slavery and slave trade, which makes a lot of sense if you're American, because it was such a big part of the history there, and it involved so many people. But if you're European, sorry about that, I live just a few kilometers away from an airbase, and some days there's quite a lot of flying going around, and it's rather noisy. But anyway, where was I? If you're European, all that trauma that comes from the colonization and of the Americas and from the slave trade might not be quite as prominent in terms of ancestors. I'm not saying that we as Europeans can ignore it. It was something that Europeans did, so it's part of our history, it's part of our cultural heritage. But in terms of our another airplane, yeah, they usually fly in sets of two, so if there's one, there's usually another one soon after. But anyway, the trauma of slavery and of the genocide of natives is not perhaps as prominent in your ancestor work if you're a European. There might be other things that are more prominent. European history is full of all these wars, for instance, but it tends to be, I think, like localized in another way, because Europe is very diverse. So the history of your people is going to be very different depending on where you're from and where your people are from. Sorry. But, and I'm not saying that there weren't people in Europe who were involved. Of course they were Europeans. But it would have been a minority. Most of the people who remained here would not have been involved in the slave trade, for instance. So that is not something that my ancestors necessarily had anything to do with. But there are some, there are, as I said, there are all these wars. The Second World War there are still people alive now that were around back then, but it's becoming more and more an ancestor thing. But as time passes, people of course are going to pass away, for instance. But it's something that that affected most Europeans one way or the other. I'm from Sweden. Sweden wasn't really involved in the fighting. We were neutral. But it still affected people here. The reason probably that we weren't involved in the fighting was that we let the Nazis pass through Sweden on their way to Norway. So that's how neutral we were. And it's not exactly like something to be very proud of, because of course the Norwegians suffered a lot as a result of that. But also the normal people here, even though they weren't fighting, they lived with a constant fear of the war coming here. You know, there were shortages of certain foods. They had to do the thing where you had to have these curtains to keep the light out, so your houses couldn't be seen from the air, and so on. And I mean, my granddad, he's still alive. He was born in 1939, and my grandma on my maternal side, she was born in 1941, and so their mothers in turn, I mean, they were pregnant and had small children during the war. And I mean, just imagine what that would have been like. Imagine how they would have worried for the future of their children. And that's, you know, even though we were spared from the actual war, I mean, actually being in the war would have been, of course, even worse. So it's something that affected, I think, all Europeans one way or the other. But then there are all these other wars that would have also created a lot of trauma. I mean, I'm going to talk from a Swedish perspective because I'm Swedish, and Swedish history is the history that I know more about. And I mean, we tend to think about Sweden now as a fairly peaceful place for the most part, and where people are doing fairly well, but it hasn't always been like that. Sweden historically has been fairly expansionist, I think you could say. We went to war a lot in the past, out in Europe, and had colonies, or whatever you want to call it, like in Poland and things. Especially in the 15th and 16th century, that's like Sweden was at its biggest, and Sweden got that big because of wars, of course. We went out and grabbed territories in other countries. And just like speaking locally here, this part was part of Denmark for several centuries. And when the Swedes came, the locals would have to go out and fight. They weren't necessarily soldiers, but they had this sort of guerrilla war going on with the Swedes to keep them away. And and there were, especially like right here, and this is something that you don't necessarily read about in the history books in school, because this was nowadays, this region here is like fairly peripheral from a Swedish point of view. We're right at the border. But that also means that because this was a border, this was where the fighting actually went on. So it affected people here much more than it would have affected people in, say, Stockholm or wherever. I mean, there is this bloodbath in the town where I'm from, Ronneby bloodbath, which is basically a massacre. It took place in 1564. I have some years written down here because I'm lousy with years. And that was during one of the wars with Denmark. The Swedes came and they basically massacred the people here, men, women and children. there are stories. We don't know exactly what happened, of course, because there was no TV back then. But it's said that a lot of people took refuge to the church, and that's where the massacre took place, in the area around the church. And it was it's still up on a hill, and it said that the blood was floating along the street and down to the river, and the river was turned red from all the blood. And this is like the massacre in Ronneby. It's something that we don't necessarily learn about in the history in school. Nowadays, it's something, because it doesn't really, our modern sort of image of Sweden, it doesn't fit in with that, because it's an act of cruelty and incredible violence. And so it's kind of a bit swept under the carpet. But back then, of course, it would have been a very traumatical thing, and it was a major event back then, because we know that it was used as propaganda. The Swedes used it as a trap for their propaganda as a major victory, whereas the Danes used it in their propaganda to illustrate how cruel the Swedes were. So it was a major thing back then, but it's not something that is talked about now, because it just doesn't fit in with our image here. Another example that is very local would be in the 1680s, I think, early 1680s. The population of this town was forced to move to the next town over, where the Swedish king has decided that he wanted a new city. And so he built it. There was basically nothing there before. It's called Karlskrona. He decided to build a city there. He wanted a naval base there. He built that. And of course, you had this city. You had to populate it, somehow. And so what he did was he forced the people of Ronneby to move there. And there are stories about how that happened with taxes and with rather crude methods, like taking out the windows from the houses in Ronneby and putting them in the houses in Karlskrona. And so, you can't really live in a house without windows in Sweden, because it's going to get cold. So people had to move. And all these things, depending on where you're from, there will be different things. But European history is full of these rather traumatic events, but on perhaps a smaller scale than the slave trade. There's, if we go back to Sweden, the treatment of the Samis would be one example that is very similar to what happened to the Native Americans. The Swedes came in, they took the land, they weren't allowed to use their own language in places like the schools. The children weren't allowed to learn the language. They were forced to convert to Christianity, and so on. And in general, religious persecution has been huge in Europe throughout the ages. The witch hunts would be one example that witchy people and pagan people like to talk about. But there were also all these wars between Catholics and Protestants. There is this long history of persecution of Jews in Europe. And so it's not just about, when you talk about Jewish, it's not just the Holocaust. That is just like the major event in a long history of religious persecution of Jews in Europe. And then if you go further back, you have Viking raids, for instance. again, if we talk from a Swedish perspective. And that is also like, that is something we tend to talk about, that as something that went on for a couple of 100 years in the early Middle Ages. But and it's also kind of hard to tell to what extent. I mean, most Swedes would have been farmers. They wouldn't have gone out and fight like that. But it's still something that can potentially be in our ancestors. And also, it's not as limited in time as we tend to think it is, because there's not a lot of written record, but if you look at the archaeological record, it sees that that kind of culture would have been there more or less since the Bronze Age. You know, we have the trade routes already in the Bronze Age. We have ships already in the Bronze Age that could travel pretty far along the sea routes. And there seems to have been slave trade going on, slaves, you know, involving Swedes already back in the Bronze Age. So that is not just a few centuries in the Middle Ages. It's this kind of violence and piracy and slave trade seems to have been going on for 1,000 or 2,000 years, to a greater or larger extent. And you can see here, if we talk just very locally again, on the coast between, there's a really nice archipelago here, and you can see that between the islands there are these kind of like, I don't know what you would call it in English, like palisades, but underwater. So you could control the waterway, you know, if you weren't familiar with the place, if you didn't know where these things were, you wouldn't be able to navigate and get into land. And that would of course be useful if you were involved in trade. You could tax anyone who wanted to come in and out, but it's also like a defensive thing. It's also keeping people away that you don't want around. And there seems to have been a certain amount of piracy going on, and that would not have been just here. It would probably have been around the coasts in a lot of places in Europe. And that is also, I mean, all these things where there is oppression and where there is violence in different ways will of course cause trauma, and that trauma can remain in the ancestral line. And another perspective is women that sort of tend to have their own trauma, where there is a lot of rape, a lot of lack of power. If you were rich, you would just be more or less traded off as, you know, cattle for marriage. And if you were poor, you would have these overlords that could do whatever you wanted with you. And that is something that has been going on also probably for millennia, it seems. And it's still more or less going on. If I talk, you know, just from my own personal history, we don't know who the father of my paternal grandma is. She went away from home to work as a maid. I don't even remember where it was, but somewhere else in Sweden. and she got pregnant. I don't know exactly how old she was either, but she got pregnant. She wasn't married, and it's very unclear who the father is. I don't know if she ever told my grandma, but if grandma knew, she certainly wouldn't tell us. She flat out refused. And I mean, that is not very unusual. It's something that happened to a lot of girls and has done for ages. And we don't know if she was seduced or by who, or if she was raped. We have no idea what happened, but that is that is one example of this trauma of our female ancestors. I mean, even if having a child when you were unmarried back then would have been stigmatizing. Another airplane. Flying is actually not so bad today. They're not flying right overhead, so it's not as loud as it sometimes can be. But anyway, so this sort of more localized history in Europe, where there hasn't been this large-scale displacements, and there isn't a lot of migration. People would have moved in the past in Europe too, of course, but it's not really on the same scale as the migration to the Americas. And most likely, unless your ancestors have moved like fairly recently in the last 100 years or so, most likely most of your ancestors will have come from near the area where you are right now, unless you've moved. To a larger extent. And I mean, the key is, as always, no matter where you are, to find out where you're from and where your people are from. And then you can research the local history there, and you can learn a lot about that, about which areas you need to have a closer look at, and which areas that might have caused trauma in your bloodline. And some parts of Europe, there's records going back quite a long time, like army records, or just records of who was born and who died in particular years and so. So I mean, genealogy can be pretty easy in Europe, especially nowadays with the internet, where they have these great sites that can tell you more or less everything because someone else already did a lot of hard work on it. Yeah, but so I think you need to approach it slightly differently in Europe than you would if you're American, and then also depending on where in Europe you are. But that's all I had to say for now. I've been rambling quite a lot, but if you like that, please subscribe. Let me know if there's anything in particular you want me to talk about. Thanks for watching.